All right, we are live.
Yes.
And we do have folks. Hi, Babita. Devesh, hi. Kiran. Priyadarshan, hi. Long time. Srirang, your mother is there. Ma'am, good evening. Thank you for being here. You're our lucky charm. We've got Prakash also. Hi, Prakash from Kundali Industries. Prakash Kundali has also joined us today.
So, Alok, while the people are trickling in, would you like to give a peek preview of who the next 4 participants are?
Yeah, so we are aware of the next 8 and the 4. We've got a very interesting lineup actually. And you know about it, Sangram. So
Absolutely.
uh, we are getting in. So after Babita and Soumya, we will be getting in Sai Alhir. Sai Alhir is he's one of those. He's a guy who's written this book called The Anti-Fragility Edge. He's based out of the US, and he will be talking about how to make businesses anti-fragile, how to make environment anti-fragile. He's an expert there. He's an exponent of that. So he will be there. Sangram, you have invited the CEO of Amar
Preeti,
Chitra.
I think, yeah, we have the CEO of Amar Chitra Katha, Preeti Vyas, and one of the few publishers who's seen a massive surge during the entire COVID lockdown crisis. Range of initiatives, including tying up with travel partners and doing interesting things in publishing at a time when everyone thought everyone would be hunkering down. So we'll have some interesting perspectives coming in from Preeti. Post that, I think, Alok, we've invited Christian Sarkar, who's partnering with Philip Kotler. So we'll have some new rules of marketing being explored post-COVID with Christian. And post that, I think we have Akhil, right?
So there's a choice. We have Akhil. We've a choice between Akhil and Prabhat, so they've yet not confirmed, but we have a choice, and one of those two guys will be there. Most likely, Akhil. Akhil, he was the chairman of Blackstone. He does something on happiness, and you should listen to him. I mean, Akhil, after earning millions and millions, in fact, he said he had an offer which was close to $500 million. That would have converted to $500 million. And remember, Akhil started with Reliance, and then he went into Blackstone. Now he teaches. He's on the board both of Stanford as well as Harvard, and he teaches there. He will talk about how to balance, and that's why he said, keep me the last, guys. How to balance between money and happiness. So he's another one who's really we want to have him on the show.
Yeah, it should be an interesting one. But I guess everyone's looking forward because it's, I think, our first one on healthcare. So I think everyone's looking forward for today's session.
That's right. That's right.
Because of the current situation in which we are finding ourselves.
So we've also got Srini. Srini, thank you for being always there. Tiliga, thank you for being there. And a lot of other people. We give the perfunctory first 5-6 minutes. The other, I think having Christian on the show will be very interesting. So I don't know whether people know about Christian Sarkar. He works with Philip Kotler. Remember the guru, and hopefully we should be able to get Philip on our show one day. I don't know when, but Christian and Philip started working on new age marketing. So they talk about, this is just about 2 years ago. They started talking about new age marketing, and there is a book that he has written, which is ecosystem. So they talk about ecosystem-based marketing, because more of community, more of collaboration, more of building ecosystems, and that seems to be the future where the world is moving towards. So, and everything else is ecosystem-based, whether it's logistics and so on and so forth. I think that will be another very interesting one, Sangram. And that's your backyard, by the way. I'm not the marketer. You are the marketer. That's your backyard.
I'm looking forward to learning myself. So yeah, we learned a lot from our earlier speakers who are marketing experts, and especially I think industry perspective. There's so much of learning that we can do from each other. So I'm personally looking forward for that as well. For the participants, I think we always back up all our sessions with a blog, so that people who want a quick read can go to our blog and actually even check out like a summary. We also have YouTube recordings. The same webinar is actually also being aired live on Facebook. So some people are catching it live on Facebook. So for all of y'all who are catching it live on Facebook, a big hello from all of us. So there are multiple ways in which I think we can you can consume this content overall. And I think Stephen did something very sweet. He actually repurposed the entire interview into smaller bites, and which is something he did on his own accord. And he had put them into short videos, which kind of were then consumed by people more contextually. So yeah, there are multiple ways in which you can actually consume the content from each of these.
So we are at 6:04. Do we want to kick it off?
I think we can. Yeah, I think we can. Great. So big hello and welcome to the 7th session of Guts, Glory and Story. And we had a fantastic session last Sunday with Stephen Sonsino. And Stephen Sonsino gave us some fantastic inputs in terms of building your legacy, that too in the middle of COVID. And what a way to end it. I mean, he actually told a sweet story, which reminded me of Zen and the power of now. And here we are on a slightly more somber note on a slightly more serious topic, COVID, right? No positive news yet. So many positive cases, 2,000 plus in Bombay. We were speaking to Sid right now, 4,000 plus in Bangalore. And there doesn't seem to be any silver lining at all. Hopefully we'll hear some positive words of encouragement from our host, our guest today, CEO and MD of Biocon, Sid Mittal. But before that, a brief introduction about us. I'm Sangram Surbe, adman, filmmaker, storyteller, and with me is my co-host Alok Sinha, serial CEO, entrepreneur, investor, and author, whose book, appropriate for the current times, is out in the market from Taylor and Francis, right? We're going to throw some questions about COVID and the future of technology in medicine to Sid. First half an hour is all ours. And after that, trust me, all questions you have related to this pandemic, please throw them to Sid because he's the right man to answer all of those, right? And now for a more formal introduction of our guest today, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and co-host, Alok. Alok, over to you.
Thank you, Sangram. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Siddharth Mittal, CEO of Biocon, to Guts, Glory and Story. You know, I met Sid as a young man nearly 20 years ago. He was a practicing chartered accountant then and in a software technology company. And many years later today, Sid's story is a symbol of self-transformation. What can I say, Sid? From being a CFO to being a CEO, from being in a tech industry to a medicine and a medical research organization. And I know this is a testimony to some real hard work in a very difficult domain. And Sid is all of 41. So ladies and gentlemen, presenting our power speaker for today, speaking on COVID and the future of healthcare, Siddharth Mittal. Sid, first of all, welcome to Guts, Glory and Story.
Thank you, Alok and Sangram, and good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of today's session. And I really look forward to sharing my thoughts and discussing, how the whole paradigm is changing in the way we treat various forms of diseases, and also share my thoughts on what is the way forward for treatment of COVID-19. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be part of today's session. And thanks to both Alok and Sangram for inviting me to be on the session.
Thanks, Sid. So, here's the first one from me. In fact, you're the first one on our show from the healthcare industry. And today it is a sheer race against time for humankind against the pandemic. And everyone would want to know, where are we in general with a COVID treatment drug? And what is Biocon doing? Also, is it a brand new molecule research which is being developed? Or is it repurposing of existing drugs? Because depending upon these two, how quickly you come out in the market, that will get determined. So Sid, over to you with this one.
Sure. So, see, when you look at the overall treatment paradigm, you have to really segregate into two different paths. One is what we call prophylactic treatment, which is really a preventive care, or the vaccines, right? Today, you give vaccine to a healthy person so that he does not develop a particular form of virus. So I'll talk about a vaccine, where the world is in terms of getting the vaccine and what are the challenges in getting a safe and an efficacious vaccine. And the second form of treatment is the treatment, the actual treatment, right? When somebody gets infected with COVID, how do you treat the patient? Now, which is what we have all seen so far in the last 6-7 months, that the virus is being treated in multiple forms. And maybe I'll start with the actual treatment and where we are, what Biocon is doing, and how the repurposing has been done. Now, as you know that to get any drug to the market or to patients is a long run process. It's the most important thing that you have to establish is the safety of the drug, because these are any new drug which has not been given to a human being, the safety takes a lot of time to be established, because while a drug might work temporarily to treat the disease, but the main thing is, does it have any long-term impact on your body? So unless you have more and more time data, you will not know if there are any side effects. We have seen many drugs which have had carcinogenic effects. So you have to ensure that while the drug does the job it is supposed to do in the short term, but it doesn't create any long-term impact. So repurposing was the only way when the virus hit the world. There were various drugs which were tried out, the antiretrovirals, which drugs like remdesivir, drugs like favipiravir, these are becoming standard of care today. Then we also have various other simple things like the paracetamol, right? Paracetamol, azithromycin. Because what is coronavirus? It's another form of virus, but at the end of it, the symptoms are of that of common cold or flu or headache or fever. So these are all time-tested drugs which will cure a patient. So that will obviously take your fever down to take care of your flu. But the virus load in your body, if the virus load has to go down, that's when you give the antiretrovirals. Now, we've seen, as I said, that remdesivir and favipiravir has worked quite well, and people are recovering. But these are all mild symptoms patient, or what we call as symptomatic mild patients. Now, when it gets to mild to severe symptoms, and where the virus actually attacks your lungs, and you start seeing your lungs getting thicker, and it kind of the virus load starts multiplying, and that's when you see people being put on ventilators. Now, the mortality rate actually when somebody is on ventilator is quite high. And so what you have to do is get your virus load down. And so again, there are a lot of drugs which are being repurposed there. There is tocilizumab, which basically reduces the infection, what we call cytokines level. And again, Biocon has had a drug called itolizumab, which was approved 7 years back for psoriasis. And this drug basically controls the cytokine levels. Again, when in a very layman language, when the virus enters our lung, it creates an acute respiratory disease syndrome. So your respiratory system gets impacted. And because of that, you have cytokines with level goes up, and when the cytokine storm happens, it starts impacting your other organs in the body, and that's where you have people die. So when this drug, which works in a very unique mechanism of action, which we did a clinical trial in India 3 months back on a fairly small patient population, but we had patient data of almost 800 patients. Now, the beauty of a drug which is already approved in the market is that if you really believe in the science, you believe in the drug, then you administer that drug as an off-label drug. So you don't need specific approval from regulators to administer that drug. So for the itolizumab, which I mentioned, is a drug which was there to treat psoriasis. The doctors started using it. They gave it to the patients. They saw some very encouraging results. And just to give you, the trial that we did in India was a 20-patient trial on itolizumab, and there were 10 patients on placebo, or which is just like a water-filled cartridge, right? Now, of the 20 patients, everybody recovered, and the patients who were on placebo, seven of them actually died. Now, this drug, now we are developing it for the developed markets and other emerging markets. So we have licensed this drug to an American biotech company called Equilium, who's going to start a global clinical trial, and hopefully sometime in 2021 we should be able to get an approval for this drug. Now, like this, there are many drugs which are being repurposed, which are being trialed, and I think on the treatment side, I think that the key to treatment from all the patients that I've seen here is early detection and early medication. Now, what you want is that a patient, if early intervention, early medication, if you can prevent a patient to go on ventilator, that's when you can save lives. Now, again, one of the unique things about itolizumab is we've seen that before there was no other alternative treatment. 90% of the patients who went on ventilator actually died. And with itolizumab, even though it's supposed to be given before you go on ventilator, 50% of the patients who were given itolizumab actually recovered, and they're very healthy today. So when you look at the treatment, these are all repurposed drugs. But what the world is looking at is vaccines, right? Because at the end of it, everybody needs vaccine. You need prophylactic vaccine. And we know of various vaccines under development. Obviously, Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was one of the first vaccine which entered a phase 3 trial. Then we have Pfizer vaccine, Moderna vaccine, Novavax vaccine. From India, we have Bharat Biotech, Zydus. Zydus is not yet in phase 3, but Bharat Biotech vaccine has entered phase 3. Now, the challenge of vaccine development is that vaccine is basically an antigen that you're trying to inject or infuse in your body. Now, the success of a vaccine is on two fronts, right? The safety, is the vaccine safe? Is it, there are no side effects over a longer period of time? And for any vaccine to show efficacy, you need to actually infuse 20-30,000 people. Now, that's the kind of, while you can get today healthy volunteers, because you can't give it to patients, but to get so many people dosed and get data on efficacy is going to take time. And that's why all these vaccines are taking time. I mean, today, when I really look at in a normal scenario, right now we're in an emergency scenario, but in a normal scenario, it takes anywhere between 2 to 3 years to get a vaccine. Now, you're trying to do the same thing in less than a year. So where will you compromise? I think somewhere there will be a compromise. Either it's safety or efficacy, because you cannot get a vaccine which works 100% in preventing the virus and is 100% safe. So the clinical data from all the drugs under development becomes very important in terms of what are the signs we are seeing. And I think it's anybody's guess that which of these 7, 8 vaccines which are in advanced stages would be really successful and at what level. I know that like in US and India recently, the regulators have said that any vaccine which is even 50% efficacious in treating people or preventing the drug or preventing the virus from entering the patient would be deemed acceptable. Now they have lowered the bar in a lot of ways because in a normal vaccine development, this period would have been much longer. So I feel that, I mean, this is my personal take. Again, as I said, this is anybody's guess. I don't think anybody can predict with high level of accuracy when the vaccine will come and which vaccine will be the best. But I think if I am a betting guy, I would say somewhere in the first quarter to first half of 2021 is when we will have a vaccine where larger patient or larger population can start dosing themselves. The biggest challenge will be capacity because whichever vaccine comes out, the vaccine is typically manufactured in smaller scale, unlike many other drugs where you can manufacture in much larger scale. So the capacity to create capacity overnight is not possible. So there is going to be a shortfall of capacity. Obviously, all these companies in the West are gonna sell the vaccine in developed markets in the US, and the US funding agencies like BARDAs and NIH, they have underwritten the capacity in advance. So pretty much all the companies who are going to come out with vaccine is the US government has underwritten the capacity. So by the time world gets the vaccine and the last uh, person gets a vaccine, it's going to take at least 2 to 3 years minimum, because that's the capacity creation takes time, and we have 7 billion people in the world, right? So this virus is here to stay for some period of time. Obviously, we will modify uh, our lifestyle, our livelihood, because that's also important. But I think I would not be uh, optimistic in saying that this virus is going away this year or next year, right? I mean, so we have to just be ready, we have to be prepared, and we have to fight the virus.
So Sid, that brings me to the question. That A, we're very clearly seeing that vaccine itself is a good 8, 9 months away. Post that, we're saying by the time it reaches the last person, is going to be another 2 to 3 years, right? Is there any positive news at all? And in an era where we're talking about CRISPR technology and nanobots, and human beings vying for lengthening of human life, longevity increasing, what is so special about this virus that it's becoming so tricky to resolve? And till the time that the last person gets a vaccine, what is the word of hope, or what is the message that someone like you, who's from the medical profession, would give to people like us who are common people on the street?
Well, as we know, this coronavirus, it's a novel strain. It's never been seen in humans before, and it jumps very fast, spreads very fast. And I mean, in 8 to 9 months, obviously, today we have had 3.5 crore people being infected. And obviously, the pace at which this infection is spreading is going up. By the time the vaccine comes, we would have had almost at a high level guess maybe 10 crore people being infected right
Wow.
now. uh, that is only what's reported. Obviously there is another equivalent number which is not reported. So the only positive thing is that the immunity would be developed, at least for people who've been affected. The antibodies would be developed. And I think if you look at last 8, 9 months, we have obviously become more smarter. The treatment protocol has evolved a lot. It's changed multiple times. It's evolved, but at least now it's no longer uncertain. I mean, if you look at March when India first announced the lockdown, there was panic, right? There was nobody knew what to do, what was the treatment paradigm. Today, at least we are aware of what needs to be done. Now, can there be a magic wand between now and a vaccine development? I don't think so, right? I mean, it's something which is humanly not possible. Now, today, all that I can say, I can advise is that you have to take certain precautionary steps. We People are getting impatient because of all lockdown and all, but still, social distancing and wearing the mask and using sanitizer, these are absolute basic things that everybody has to exercise the caution on. And when you look at if there are any symptoms, test yourself, because test and trace and treat is the only way we're going to prevent mortality. We're going to prevent further spread, because it's a simple thing. When you look at the symptoms of vaccine of coronavirus, it's like you have those symptoms in a normal course 6 times a year. It was common flu, headache, fever. You have that, as I said, every alternative month. Now you might think that this is same thing I used to have every time and there's nothing unique, but actually it's better just go on a safe side and go and test yourself, because while you will recover, what you will do is prevent the spread from to your family members and friends. So yeah, I mean, I think when I look at the other question, Sangram, that you had in terms of nanotechnologies and all, that's not something right now people are looking at for coronavirus. I mean, there's a lot of evolution happening in the way the drugs are being developed in other therapies like cancer and diabetes, but not so much on for coronavirus. I think everybody is focused on getting vaccine, and then for treatment getting better retrovirals, antiretrovirals.
But if you take the numbers alone, I mean, even if we were vaccinating 100,000 people, 100,000 people a day, with whatever our current population volume is, it'll take us 37 years. I mean, I don't know where the math is. And I have a question which has come on my cell phone. So sorry, I'm going to read it off here because it's connected to what you said. It comes from Prakash Kundalia. And he says, what will be the price in terms of human lives before the herd immunity in India sets in? So what he's saying is, look, it's vaccine on one side, and my math says 37 and a half years before every Indian can get vaccinated. Assuming 100,000, maybe you go 10 times that.
Yeah,
even
capacities will be more than 100,000. But one important thing is that, again, you look at many other flus that have happened in the past. Actually, not everybody wants to take vaccine. You go to UK, you go to US, half the population is against vaccine. So the assumption is actually everybody is voluntarily taking vaccine, but people do not take vaccine, especially in the West. They are very against vaccine.
So the question is, one side is the vaccine and whatever is the time. The other side is the herd immunity. But herd immunity means deaths, right? I mean, that's mortality. What, in your opinion, and that's the question, what is that number of human deaths before actually the herd immunity sets in? And I know it's a very it's a question which scares. It's a very scary question, but we need to be prepared for those.
Well, I'll come to the actual percentage later, because there's no science to it, there's no data to it. But in my mind, herd immunity as a concept sounds good, but there is a lot of collateral damage in the herd immunity. I feel that if, let's say, if there were no restrictions, people were allowed to operate normally, and the theory was that let everybody get infected, right? And you have antibodies. The collateral damage will be the vulnerable population, which would be all people with comorbidities, aged population, and even young people, where the detection and the treatment has not happened, would pay a price. Because today, as I said, that when many of us think that it's a common cold, common fever, it will go away next day. And it does go away. In a lot of cases, it does go away. But still it leaves that virus which is multiplying in your body. The virus load is going up. And if you do not treat it in time, then and you get to a severe, moderate to severe stage, it's too late. And that's why the death rate in young people is high because of late treatment. Obviously, the death rate in comorbid people is high. And in India, there's a very high incidence of diabetes and blood pressure and hypertension and cholesterol, right? And unfortunately, 80% of those patients having these comorbidities are not even aware that they have these diseases, especially diabetes, right? So what would happen is that you would have a high mortality rate and in this vulnerable population. And one thing again I feel is where we do not have any data is how coronavirus impacts children, right? Today, when you really look at children have all been bundled at home, they have not been allowed to go to school, they have not been allowed to step out of house, so they are all safe. So when you actually look at number of children who've been affected by coronavirus,
Very good.
is very, very low. Now, if you go towards herd immunity, this is a one section of population which can get impacted. I mean, that the price we will pay will be very high. So I mean, I'm personally not an advocate of herd immunity. I think the price you will pay in terms of mortality could be anywhere between 5 to 10%, which is a very high number.
Very large.
Huge number. My
Yeah.
So I think there is one more question which is again popped up and is very relevant to the conversation right now. And I think even Steven Sonsino in our last webinar said that the only way to tackle the pandemic is through collaboration. And he likened the entire scenario to the World War. And he very clearly said that, during the World War, it started off as a war by nations, and then nations collaborated essentially to take on a common enemy. And he said, unless nations collaborate in this war against this pandemic, things may not improve very soon. And I think Sujita's got a relevant question on a smaller scale. He says, do you see a scenario where there is an inter-pharma company collaboration to tackle a much bigger enemy, which is COVID? Is that happening in the industry?
So that, by the way, happens even on a normal course. The entire pharma ecosystem works in collaboration. So
Okay.
I'll give you an example of Biocon itself. So Biocon has multiple collaborations. So I'll take an example of Sanofi. Sanofi is a large French company. So we have a collaboration with them on certain drugs. And on certain drugs, we have generics or biosimilars targeting their blockbuster drugs. Now, if you look at globally, uh, I mean, again, I'll talk about Biocon itself. The Biocon has had collaborations with Pfizer's and Bristol Myers Squibb for various drugs. So the collaboration is a very, very open and acceptable thing in the industry. Now, what you need is academia and pharma company collaboration, because the actual scientific discovery, the translational research happens in research institutes. I mean, if you look at the blockbuster drugs in the world has come out from an academic institutes, whether it's Harvard or Stanford or Oxford, because that's where the translational research is happening. And you look at Oxford vaccine, right? And now again, it's a vaccine which is actually being worked upon by Oxford. Now, AstraZeneca is a company which is going to take it commercially forward and clinically develop it. But there are multiple collaborations being there in the industry. And today, I'll give you an example. If Moderna vaccine is successful, the Moderna cannot commercialize this vaccine globally. Right? They will have to do collaborations with local companies, regional companies, companies like Serum Institute, which we've seen that Serum Institute has tied up with multiple companies to get the vaccines in India and other emerging markets. So no company in the world will be able to do this alone. So collaborations are important, and collaborations are something that have been there as a part of the overall pharma community, and will happen for coronavirus as well.
That's great. That's great. So, which brings me to the next question. I think we're moving to the whole topic of personalized medicine. And I think a few days back, we saw Apple Watch, which is a revolutionary device. And the headline very clearly said, future of healthcare is on your wrist.
Yeah.
You know, it basically, it's not just the Apple Watch 6, but I think there's a range of devices which will essentially be collecting data on your body vitals and giving you timely data in terms of how future ailments can be prevented. And I believe Biocon is doing exciting work in the domain of diabetes and cancer with respect to precision medicine and personalized medicine. We'd love to hear about what are Biocon's initiatives in these domains.
By the way,
So,
Sid, this is Sangram's favorite question. I mean, I couldn't have asked you this. He loves the Apple Watch. Go ahead.
well, I'll talk about diabetes first because it's just something hot off the press. Recently, we announced a collaboration with a company called Voluntis. To bring a product, it's a digital therapeutic product called Insulia, which basically what it does, it's an app on your phone, and it's a prescribed app, so nobody can just download the app and start the treatment. Now, when you have diabetes, whether it's type 2 or type 1, you are given a mealtime insulin, which you take before breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then you have a basal insulin, which you take once a day, or there are some once in 3 days kind of drugs. And these drugs are titrated. So every time you take the drug, you have to first measure your glucose level, and then you have to titrate the dose. So you have typically the titration in the device. So because if you take excess dosage, you can have hyperglycemia. So you need to take the right amount of drug. Now, the glucose level changes on a regular basis. So what this app does is basically allow the doctors to prescribe or to manage the treatment of patients. So you basically take your blood level, glucose level, you enter into this app, then the app automatically calculates how much drug you need. It sends the data to your prescribing doctor on a regular basis, who can then modify if there is any modification required in the treatment itself. Now, what this does is obviously the biggest issue in treatment of diabetes is the compliance, that people do not take drug regularly, and that kind of escalates to multiple issues. The second is people do not take the right dosage of drug. Now, if you have a better compliance by having uh, an app like Insulia, which basically ensures that you are compliant, your doctors uh, monitoring you real time rather than a periodic hospital visit or a clinic visit, it gives a better outcome. And from payers' perspective, because at the end of it, in the US, all the costs are being reimbursed by an insurance company. It brings down the overall treatment cost, because the higher the, see, one is a drug cost. When you look at the overall healthcare cost, drug is only 30 to 40% of the overall cost. The remaining comes from hospital visits, the clinic visits, the tests, scans. And to bring down the overall healthcare cost, you have to obviously bring a more affordable medicines. That's what we do as a company, right? That's what we do. That's what is our mission, is to bring more affordable drugs to the patients. And the second is, how do you bring down the overall healthcare cost? So it's like going beyond the pill. It's going beyond just the drug to bring down the overall healthcare cost. Now, I feel that there is going to be a lot of focus in the the digital therapeutics and bringing down the healthcare cost. And the pace at which the technology is moving, I really think that in next 5 to 10 years, we would see a huge change in the way we treat these kind of diseases. And these more important for chronic diseases like diabetes or psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis, where after, I mean, in acute disease, it's the treatment is for few days. You have a better compliance, but in chronic is where you need. I see a very important role for personalized medicines to be there, and more on the therapeutic side and the devices side. But when I come now look at the personalized medicine on the treating acute diseases like cancer. Now, there's been a lot of progress again there. I mean, the entire treatment paradigm for cancer has evolved a lot. I mean, going from pure synthetic drugs, drugs, which had obviously much more side effects, to targeted therapies. Uh, we had many drugs 1 to 2 decades back, which were very targeted to the tumor in the body. And these are typically biologic drugs. So the safety profile is much better than typical synthetic drugs. To now what we call immunotherapy, right? So immunotherapy is basically trying to alter the immune system of your body, wherein if you infuse an antibody, the drug treating antibody, which kind of suppresses the immune system so that the drug kind of gets accepted by a body. So that's been the evolution. But finally, we see a lot of work and many drugs under development in something what we call as CAR-T. Biocon, while is not directly involved in CAR-T, but Kiran Mazumdar has started a company called Immuni, which basically is bringing these CAR-T therapies to patients in India. This is still in development mode. I mean, globally, there are only 2 CAR-T drugs approved. There are over 1,200 CAR-T drugs under development, various stages of development. But the issue is CAR-T is basically a customized drug. So what you do in CAR-T is take out the blood from the patient who has a cancer. You modify the sequence, you infuse the drug, which is more customized for that patient. Because today, if you look at, I think your question around precision medicine. Now, what is precision medicine? Basically, it's customized treatment, because otherwise what drugs are available in the market is a single drug which kind of fits all, right? So one size fits all kind of approach versus the precision medicine, which is customized. So CAR-T is such a drug or a therapy which is customized. I said that you basically the immune system in body has natural defense against infection, including the cells which fight the cancer. So in CAR-T, the cellular immunotherapy basically utilizes the immune cell from the patient, which is genetically altered outside the body. So it's done in a test tube, right? And reinfused into the patient. These re-engineered cells. And it basically then goes and settles down in the body and then increases the defense system of the body to fight these cancers. So now in US, a CAR-T treatment cost is over $1 million. It's that high. So what we have done is we're trying to bring this therapy in India at a very, very affordable price. And the reason, I mean, this initiative could have been taken by Biocon as a company to start this company, but Kiran specifically chose that this should be done as more as a philanthropy rather than as a for-profit initiative. Because if it becomes for-profit, then you are not kind of bringing down the cost. And why you have to do tie-ups. So today, this being a customized therapy, it has to be very regional. So today, like we have a tie-up with Narayan Hridayalaya in Bangalore or Manipal Hospital. Because when you undergo this treatment, You have to be, and since it's a very customized solution, you have to be the patient where the hospital patient is being treated, the hospital in which the patient is being treated. You need to have facility to do this whole, I would say, the modification of the cell. So we see that collaboration between companies who supplies drug, because again you are infusing a drug in that therapy, and hospitals where the patients are being treated, and the research uh, itself, the core research, has to come together. So this initiative was started, as said by Kiran, along with few others. And we really see that this could be a game changer. Now, there are also gene therapies and all where you basically again do the same thing. You take the gene from a patient, genetically you modify it and kind of infuse it back. Again, there's not been any blockbuster success there, but a lot of research is happening. And I mean, today, with artificial intelligence, with so much technology available, so much knowledge available, definitely see that in the next decade, in the 2020s to this whole next 10 years, we would see the treatment paradigm evolve a lot. And
That was that was one question which I had, which came to my mind is, on one hand, you talk of, personalized medicine, precision medicine, which is customized. And on the other hand, we talk of mass deployment, ultimately. Between the two, does AI play a role?
well, AI will play a role in the way the drugs are being developed. I'll give you an example of clinical development. When we were talking about vaccine, I said that the vaccine, before a vaccine is commercially launched, you need to have data of 20, 30,000 healthy volunteers. And in terms of safety data and efficacy data, now that's how traditionally the drugs are being developed in that form. You do a phase 1 trial, phase 2, phase 3, and then kind of you're conforming in every other phase the data that you got from the previous phase, right? Now, if you have artificial intelligence, which kind of mimics the trial done in a smaller patient population,
Hmm.
and what could happen in a larger set trial, you can save the development cost and the development timelines. Now, there are many companies, these are large pharma companies in the West, in Europe, in US, who are working with the regulators. Now, FDA itself has evolved, their thinking has evolved, where earlier they were not open to such kind of technologies being deployed in drug development. Now, when Scott Gottlieb, who was the FDA commissioner, came in, he was very pro technology, and he said that we should adopt newer technologies, artificial intelligence, in the way we do the drug development. So that's one area. The second is imaging. When again drugs, the uh, uh, like cancer today, imaging plays a very important role, because you do scans and see how the current scan only shows you how the cancer cells have affected various parts of your body, but it does not predict what's going to happen in the future, how the cancer is going to spread, and how it's going to multiply, right? So we have got now artificial intelligence in the area of radiology, and where people are simulating that how the cancer cell will multiply, in what period of time, how will it impact the other parts of the body. So you can do early intervention and early treatment. And as I said, that things will evolve a lot. I mean, there's so much money being invested and in the research in these fields, that definitely think that we will, if when we are in 2030, the world would have changed and world would have evolved for a much better treatment paradigm for these, I would say, chronic and both acute therapies.
So Sid, by the way, to our viewers, we are interspersing our questions with your question. So feel free to keep throwing Q&A. We're doing that. But Sid, coming back, you talked about affordability, and I remember when we had met you had mentioned that getting the drug molecule is probably not as difficult as getting it affordable. And especially in India, affordability is a very, very important aspect, because money is not there. So, and you mentioned that Biocon has been at the forefront of biosimilars. So, which areas are you putting that research money in? And what kind of cost differentials are you looking at? I remember you said $1 million, but you didn't tell in India how much will it be. But other than the CAR-T piece which you saw, which other places you're doing, and what is the differential that you're getting to this country?
So, see, Biocon's mission is to bring affordable, innovative drugs to patients worldwide. Now, I mean, it's a simple statement, but when you actually deep dive into what it means, there are drugs available in the market, right? But it's out of reach for most people in the world, and it's unaffordable. So one is access. That today, a lot of these drugs are not even available in most parts of the world, and even if it is available, it is at a price where people can't afford it. So, I mean, our vision is to bring these drugs at a high quality, affordable price by widening the access to patients. Now, I'll give you an example of a drug called Lipitor, which, if you're aware, was a blockbuster drug from Pfizer. In 2007 is when it was out of patent. And in 2007, it was world's largest selling drug at $3 billion in annual sales. Today, you have multiple drugs at $3 billion plus, but in those days, $3 billion was a big number. That drug used to sell in the US for over $50 to $60 a tablet. Today, it's available in India. I mean, we are one of the largest manufacturers of atorvastatin globally. Is available for less than 5 rupees a tablet. Now, this is a very important drug to bring down the cholesterol level. And again, cholesterol, high cholesterol is one of the issues in most parts of the world. So that's one example. Now, when I look at cancer, there's a drug called Herceptin, which was a drug by Roche, which was for treatment of HER2 positive breast cancer. This drug was sold by Roche for, let's say, roughly $3,000 per vial. That's an injection. In India, it was sold for give or take $1,500 to $2,000 per vial. So the treatment cost for a patient, it was a 1-year therapy. So you take that drug over a period of 1 year, was over 10 lakhs. And in breast cancer, you have a relapse rate. So while you treat it, there can be a good relapse after a period of time. Now, how many patients in India can afford 10 lakhs treatment just on the drug? Then you have hospital costs, doctor's cost, other drugs that you have to take along with this drug. Now, when we launched this drug in 2014, the drug was launched at less than 30% of the innovator cost. And today the drug is available at 10% of the cost. So the drug treatment cost has gone down to almost a lakh rupees from 10 lakhs. What has it done is earlier, if every year you had X number of patients who were going through the therapy, today you have at least 5 to 6X who are able to afford this treatment. Especially, I mean, you can imagine a 10 lakh rupees plus could have been only afforded by a certain section in the population, which was maybe 5 or 10% patient of the population in the society. But at 1 lakh today, a lot of middle class people can afford. A lot of government can afford. So access, when I mean, earlier, let's say a central government healthcare scheme or a state government healthcare scheme, they never had this drug in the tender because even the state government and the central government couldn't afford. Now this drug is in the tender of the healthcare scheme. So now the government is buying as a part of insurance, universal healthcare, and giving it to patients. So it's kind of covered the entire pyramid where every patient irrespective of the economic stature, can afford this drug. So there are multiple such drugs that we have in the market and are in various stages of development, which we plan to bring to patients world over. I mean, obviously the you make your money from your developed market sales because that's where you get a huge premium. But when you look at uh, most people in the world live in not so economically uh, high countries. I mean, it's a non-developed markets. So that's where we want to bring these drugs in these parts of the world at an affordable price and at a high quality. I think the quality is also very important because there are companies who have some of these drugs in India, but quality is a big issue. So we have same facility being used to develop drugs, same drug for US and let's say in Indonesia or India or uh, I would say like Chile or Peru.
I think we have a interesting question. Actually, it's more of a proposition for you, Sid. It comes from someone who's from Dr. Appara Foundation from Vizag, and he's saying, "Hi, Siddharth. How open are you as Biocon on working in collaboration with us in repurposing an existing drug, which is effective in treating ARDS-induced cytokine storms in COVID cases?"
Well, we'll be very happy to learn about it. As I had said earlier, itolizumab is exactly doing the same thing. We've got the label where it's the ARDS caused by CRS is being treated by this antibody. It's an anti-CD6 drug. But we'll be very happy to learn the research that you have done, what drug you're talking about, and so you can reach out to me separately. Maybe my email can be, I'll just send my email on this chat, email ID, and you can reach out to me and we can discuss details.
Brilliant, brilliant. I think I have a personal question, Siddharth, but I'm going to keep that for the end. I think one of the questions also is pertaining to relapse of COVID-19, patients recovering from COVID-19, and again it coming back. So people who've passed that and who the initial hypothesis was that once you've recovered from COVID, you're safe. You're the safest person on earth, right? Apparently, it doesn't seem to be so. So, what are the precautions one needs to take even after you've kind of gone past having recovered from COVID?
Well, precautions are the same. Social distancing, wear the mask and use sanitizers. But yes, I mean, the relapse can happen. See, we are all, every human body is a different composition of chemicals and biology, right? I mean, no two humans are the same. Now, how the antibody develops in a person might be very different from others. The relapse can happen if your body does not develop any antibody. That's when your relapse can happen because if you've had an exposure again. Uh, but though the rate, I'm quite positively surprised that the rate has been very low. When you look at globally, the rate of relapse has been very, very small, and which is an encouraging sign that the antibodies that means are being built uh, in the body, especially if you had COVID. But yeah, I mean, you have to continue to exercise caution. Can't become carefree. And, but unlike a common flu, like a flu, if you've had flu, you typically have uh, relapse or you have flu every year, right? I mean, like in US, every person has flu every year. That's why during flu season, flu shots are given to everyone. Now, what we don't know is the antibody stays for how long, because the COVID itself has been there for 9 months, right? So whether the antibody stays for 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, or lifelong, that you will only know over a period of time. So right now we just have data for 6 months. So like again, I'll use the analogy of the flu. So flu shot is taken as an annual shot in the US because the theory is the antibodies stay only for a year, and that's why you have to kind of replenish that artificially by taking the vaccine after every 1 year. So by the way, going back to the vaccine challenge, that if the antibody does not stay for long, then your problem is multiplied, because now you need 2 to 3 years, 4 years to dose everyone with the vaccine. But then you need the repeat doses.
Oh.
Sid, our Q&A chat is buzzing, and it shows that people are very, very fearful. Fearful about how do we manage kids not getting it, fearful about how do we manage not getting it again, and coming out of it if we get it again, all of that. And I think what you said, just keep the social distancing, just keep the safety on till the time there is enough data, and that data will come only a period of time. I mean,
Yeah.
artificial intelligence can tell us about the biological molecular pieces, but probably how will people react and what impact do we have will be only by going through it. And so that's a hard journey. But the questions are buzzing here. It's just coming on and on.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one personal question, and then we'll see if we can squeeze out a bit, because I'd like you to elaborate on this. And that's it on your personal journey. At all of 41, you're heading a company that's at the beachhead of medical innovation, but you have a background in software and technology and finance. We'd love to know about your journey, how you jumped into this passion for medicine, for curing. Please walk us through your journey, please.
You didn't sound like a CA, by the way. Said you sounded like a doctor.
Yeah,
But go
that's
ahead.
the coincidental thing. When I get a lot of emails, I get it as Dr. Siddharth Mittal, and I say I'm a CA, by the way. But yeah, I mean, it's been a very interesting journey for me. I basically I'm a chartered accountant and Bachelor's of Commerce by education. Joined a Big Four, Ernst & Young in India, and was in the US for a few years before I jumped on the IT bandwagon in early 2000. That's when I'd met Alok in Scandent. We were colleagues there, and was in the IT industry for over 10 years. But somehow, even though the IT industry itself evolves, but for a finance person, there was no evolution, right? So it was like kind of getting boring for me. Like you're doing the same thing again and again. I mean, whether you work for one company or the another, from a finance perspective, it's the same job. And so I wanted to really experiment something different in a new industry. And when this opportunity came my way, there was nothing, I mean, there was no blinking of eyes. Biocon was, I mean, I joined Biocon 7.5 years back, was a was a leader in this space, and it was kind of convergence of biology and technology. Was a global leader in this space. Kiran herself, as you know, is a visionary with a lot of ideas, innovation that she spoke about when I first met her. So that attracted me to Biocon. And when I came in, I mean, at least good thing for finances, it's an industry agnostic function that you money is money, right? Whether you are in pharma, you are in bank, you are in IT, the color of the money is same, right? You have to manage money as a finance professional. And so I joined in. I had a support of a lot of people. My initial stint who explained the industry painstakingly, kind of explaining the jargons and how the whole the biotech company, the pharma companies operate, which made me took on as a CFO of Biocon when I was 35, and then you know the role of CFOs have evolved a lot. If you look at it, I mean, the CFOs are actually working as a trusted business partners for the CEOs and going beyond finance. And I took on a lot of interest. I mean, at the end of it, it's about how much interest you want to take. I could continue to do your traditional finance role or take interest beyond it. In a pharma world, it's all about research. It's all about manufacturing, and it's about commercialization, right? Beyond your own function, which was finance. And I took a lot of interest in understanding these various facets of the industry, and that kind of led me to spending more and more time into the business and kind of. In fact, before I took on as a CEO last year, 2 years before that, I had actually stopped doing finance. Like a great finance team who was kind of managing everything. I was spending more time on R&D and and the business side, and so many interactions with people. So that's how you start taking interest, understanding details, and that's how I've evolved into a doctor. But yeah, I mean, it's been a very interesting journey for me, and been very many people who've been part of this journey, who made this journey so smooth, including my family, including my predecessors. Arun Chandavarkar, who was the CEO before me, who retired, from whom I took on. Murli, who was the CFO, who had retired. Again, I had taken on from him. Kiran herself, the approach of kind of encouraging talent from outside, encouraging fresh ideas, encouraging, I mean, age no bar, right? And that's a very important approach because in Biocon, the culture is young people are given a platform to grow and to kind of show themselves, prove themselves. So yeah, it's been quite fortunate to be in this company. It's been in right time, right time, right place.
Yeah.
So, I know we're out of time, but I must air this one because this comes from a student. And basically, Gladys Saji wants to know what are the core skill people like you seek in freshers before, when they look at you. So just a quick few minutes if you can give us, because I know there are a lot of students here who are listening to you.
See, basically, for a fresher, you have to go through. If you are a biotechnology graduate, you would have had the uh, classroom learning over a 4-year. Let's say if you have done a bachelor's, you would have had a 4-year learning. If you've done masters or PhD, then that much more learning. But what we see often is, especially for the bachelors, they lack practical experience. And when we hire such people, the freshers, becomes very difficult to deploy them straight in the plant or in the manufacturing operations or R&D operations, because again, for drug manufacturing, drug development, it's all about safety. So you cannot compromise at all on safety by deploying freshers. So typically what we do is we came up as a part of our CSR initiative, something a finishing school. It's called Biocon Academy, where we get these freshers and we subsidize 75% of the cost. So it's a subsidized cost where the fresher basically goes through 3 months of practical training. So it's a combination of classroom training and practical training in our labs. We've tied up with various other companies and various other labs. And during this 3-month period, they are given a comprehensive experience, including hands-on experience in manufacturing, various aspects of biotechnology, whether it's quality, manufacturing, R&D. So you kind of, whatever you've learned in a college, you kind of finish that last mile by giving that finishing touch, after which they are able to be deployed in the operations, whether it's manufacturing, quality, R&D. So I think, I mean, we do also hire freshers, but we see that this finishing actually gives the edge that's required for them to, grow in their career, learn a lot more at a faster pace.
Great.
So great for all of you who have been excited by all this talk and who want to play a role in terms of making humanity safer against diseases and ailments. I think the whole field is quite exciting, and you can, I think Sid will be sharing his email ID and you can get him in touch as a student. And of course, in terms of there are a lot of people from the medical fraternity in terms of collaborations or any other questions, feel free to reach out to Sid. I think we have just about crossed our time, and I didn't see any dropout in terms of the participation. So I think, Sid, it's been a really enthralling session. To do a quick summary, I think unfortunately we don't have a definite answer to COVID, right? The only encouraging factor, which I think Sid mentioned, is that the mortality rate is high amongst those who've got comorbidities. The encouraging factor is that if you detect it early, you will scrape through. Don't let your condition deteriorate to the point where you need a ventilator, right? So apart from all the regular advice of social distancing, use of masks, if you do see symptoms, do not hesitate to test yourself, get yourself treated early, use your common paracetamols, and keep yourself from moving into phase 2 or phase 3 of COVID, right? And that's the only way.
Isolate yourself. That's also very important, which I forgot to mention. I mean, a lot of my friends who say that I've had headache or I have fever, I say first thing, isolate yourself in a room. Do not roam around in your house, and then undergo a test. Because if you are positive, at least what you have done is not spread it to your family members.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think rightly put, and I think that's the only thing that's under our control, and that's the only thing, honestly, that we can control. And as long as we keep doing that, I think all we need to do is keep ourselves safe till people like Sid and people from the fraternity deliver us the vaccine sometime later. And apna number jab aayega, then we'll get the vaccine. But till then, safety is in our own hands. With that, I think, Alok, if you have any concluding words to add.
Just a quick thank you to Sid, enthralling session, dynamite, and thank you very much. And we must also thank our viewers for being with us 1 hour on a Saturday evening. Thanks. Next Saturday, we'll be speaking to Babita Sinha and Soumya Tiwari. I call them the two crusaders of sustainability and resilience for the greens and environment. And listen to them speak about why we may be on the brink of an environmental collapse, and how each one of us, with just our immediate network, can make a huge difference in reviving this deleterious downward trend. So this and much more on Guts, Glory and Story. Do also keep a track of our social media pages for COVID Tales. With that, thank you very much again, Sid, and thanks to my co-host, Sangram. As usual, great, Sangram. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Alok and Sangram. It's been a great pleasure interacting with you.
Thanks.
Really. So with that, it's a bye-bye from us at Guts, Glory, Story. See you again next Saturday, same time at 6 p.m. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.